Hello and welcome to MEELive. Join us as together we take another look at the stories that are shaping our world.
We are broadcasting live to YouTube from Middle East Eye's headquarters here in London.
I'm Mohammed Hassan.
And I'm Matilda Manson. Today is Tuesday, the 6th of May. Mohammed, what have we got coming up on today's show?
So you might have seen it yesterday. Israel made a shocking announcement. They are expanding their military incursion into Gaza, this time without giving any land back. This is something that a lot of Palestinians have been afraid of for a long time. A lot of far-right Israeli figures have been promising for a very long time. Now that we're at this junction, what does it actually mean? We're going to be joined by a former Israeli lawmaker to tell us what is happening and how are Israelis reacting to it.
Now, of course, all of this is happening within the wider context of a massive regional escalation. Syria bombed not just Gaza, but Yemen, Lebanon, and Syria in a single day. So today we'll be zooming in on the situation in Syria and seeing what this can tell us about what we're seeing with this escalation, whether it is Israel's proclaimed defense strategy, whether this is a wider regional expansion strategy, or whether it is no strategy at all.
Lots of questions, and we'll attempt to answer as many of them as possible. Stick around, but first, let's take a look at today's headlines. Israel is calling up tens of thousands of reservists to expand its military occupation of Gaza and says it has no plans to withdraw. In a statement released to his social media account, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says the Israeli army will now hold all territories it takes and will continue the war until Hamas is defeated. He also says more than 2 million Palestinians will be pushed from the north and south of Gaza to expand Israel's so-called buffer zone permanently. This is despite public opinion in Israel overwhelmingly favoring a hostage deal that would end the war and return the remaining 59 hostages, 24 of whom are believed to still be alive. Israeli government spokesperson David Mencer says the aim is not the occupation of Gaza, but to pressure Hamas to release hostages without a deal to end the war.
The plan will include, among other things, the expanding and the holding of territories, not occupation, the expanding and holding of territories and moving the Gazan population south for its own defense and denying Hamas the ability to capture humanitarian supplies. And also there will be powerful attacks against Hamas.
Since Israel unilaterally fractured a 2-month ceasefire agreement with Hamas in March, it has denied Gaza's 2.2 million people of food, medicine, clean water, and all humanitarian aid. More than 61,000 Palestinians have been killed, with thousands still missing under the rubble. And we'll be diving into this evolving story in a few minutes with former Palestinian-Israeli lawmaker Sami Abu Shhadeh.
An attempt by Sudan's government to make the United Arab Emirates legally accountable for acts of genocide in West Darfur has been rejected by the International Court of Justice. It comes a day after a drone attack on Port Sudan by the Rapid Support Forces, the paramilitary group the UAE is accused of supplying. They steadfastly deny this accusation. ICJ judges ruled they had no jurisdiction over the matter and manifestly lacked the authority to proceed. Although the UAE is a signatory of the UN Genocide Convention, it signed up with the caveat that the ICJ was not able to hear disputes on its compliance. The case was therefore widely expected to fail on this technicality, but the UAE has claimed the ruling as proof of innocence, despite the ruling giving no verdict on the evidence against them. UAE Foreign Minister Reem Khattate said in a response, "The facts speak for themselves. The UAE bears no responsibility for the conflict in Sudan." But a summary of the ruling said the court is precluded by its statute from taking any position on the merits of the claims by Sudan. And finally, US lawmakers axed a planned vote on a controversial bill that could have seen anti-Israeli boycotters penalized with up to 20 years in prison and fines of $1 million. The proposed legislation expands a law from Trump's first term that bans boycotts against US allies levied on behalf of foreign governments. The bill would also penalize action tied to international government organizations, say, for example, the UN. Yet a number of Trump loyalists have thwarted the attempt, citing free speech concerns. Georgia Republican Marjorie Taylor Greene loudly denounced the bill on X, stating, "It is my job to defend Americans' rights to buy or boycott whomever they choose." While the bill itself does not explicitly mention Israel, its drafters have said it is designed to curtail the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, which calls for economic pressure on the Israeli government to end its abuses against Palestinians. Next up, we take a deep dive into the situation in Gaza.
Welcome back. This is MEELive's Deep Dive, where we dive into a story that is shaking up the world. Since October 7, Israel has presented three competing narratives about what it wants to achieve in Gaza, what the end goal is, what Israelis call the next day scenario. Is it to dismantle Hamas, a goal that its own generals have long maintained was impossible? Is it to rescue the hostages, an aim that despite 18 months of war has only been achieved through diplomacy? Or is it something else, what those on the far right have repeated over and over, to ethnically cleanse Gaza and bring it back under Israeli control? This week, we seem to have gotten an answer. All of the above. After breaking a ceasefire that in the first 2 months of this year led to the release of 30 Israeli hostages and hundreds of Palestinian prisoners, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu now says the real aim of the war is not the hostages, but a supreme victory over Hamas. After ducking rumors about what he may or may not have told his cabinet ministers over the weekend, Netanyahu announced it, that he's expanding the ground invasion in Gaza, calling up tens of thousands of reservists and displacing the majority of Gaza's civilian population indefinitely. And this time, he says, there will be no withdrawal.
דבר אחד יהיה ברור, לא ייכנסו ויצאו. נגייס מילואים כדי שיבואו יתפסו שטח, אנחנו יוצאים מהשטח, רק אנחנו עושים פשיטות ממה שנשאר, אנחנו לא שם. זו לא הכוונה.
אוקיי.
הכוונה הפוכה.
This is precisely what Palestinians have accused Israel of since the very beginning, that its real aim was to occupy Gaza and prevent its people from ever returning to their homes. A year ago, the very same Netanyahu told the world this would never happen.
I want to make a few points absolutely clear. Israel has no intention of permanently occupying Gaza or displacing its civilian population. Israel is fighting Hamas terrorists, not the Palestinian population. And we are doing so in full compliance with international law.
But this is not how others in his own government have described it. Over the weekend, Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich said Israel will not withdraw from Gaza even if there is another hostage deal, telling Israelis to, quote, stop being afraid of the word occupation. Meanwhile, Culture Minister Miki Zohar says Israel's real goal is, quote, the complete occupation of the Strip. And while this would inevitably endanger the lives of the hostages, he says, quote, there is no choice left. So what is the plan now? According to a former IDF strategist, the army is now pursuing what he calls the Little Gaza Plan. Amit Yagur, the former deputy head of the army's Palestinian arena, wrote in Maariv magazine this morning that Israel intends to push Gaza's people into small humanitarian encampments or Little Gazas, clearing them from population centers. The army will then focus on destroying what remains of the infrastructure and take away Hamas's ability to manage services, security, and humanitarian aid. And once these towns and cities are cleared, they will remain in Israel's control. This is Netanyahu's alternative to what more than 70% of Israelis want from him, which is a new hostage deal and an end to the war. So why is he doing this now? To help us understand the situation, we're joined now by Palestinian-Israeli politician and former Knesset member Sami Abu Shhadeh. Sami, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much for hosting me.
Netanyahu has maintained that he has no intention of occupying Gaza, and yet, if you listen to those on the far right, they have been very clear about their intentions. In your opinion, who should we believe?
First of all, surely you can never believe Netanyahu. Also, before he was wanted for the ICC and ICJ as committing the worst crime any human being can do. He's wanted for committing a genocide. He was not only known as the biggest liar of all politicians ever, also before being wanted for all this, for this crime. Netanyahu is not someone that you can believe, but we can believe the program that was published by this Israeli government few months at the beginning of the war, when the government asked one of its ministries to give different scenarios, what do they want to do with Gaza? And they proposed in one of their papers, it was published also on the 972 magazine, people can read it in English, what are the options? They had three scenarios, and they preferred the one that took about clearly ethnic cleansing all of Gaza. This is what Israel wants. This is what Netanyahu wants. This is what his extreme fascist government wants. And it's clear they have been saying this. They wrote this. They have it as a plan. What prevented this was the Egyptian insistence not to allow this to happen. But Israel is still trying to do so. And then their main target from this war is to do the ethnic cleansing in Gaza, the way they did it also in 1948.
And so when you hear the language that comes out of somebody like Bezalel Smotrich, you hear the language that comes from the cultural minister, is that representing a more honest face, in your opinion, of what the strategy is when it comes to Gaza?
First of all, let us remind everyone that when we are talking about Bezalel Smotrich, this is not like a neo-Nazi case in Germany, someone who is out of control, the whole state is against him, the constitution is against him. When we are talking about people like this extreme fascist Bezalel Smotrich or Itamar Ben-Gvir or all this extreme racists, they are Israeli elected ministers. They represent the majority in the Jewish Israeli population. The coalition was elected. And at the end of 2022, there were elections in Israel. Benjamin Netanyahu is not a dictator that came with the army to control. He is an elected figure. Same is Bezalel Smotrich. Same is Bezalel Smotrich and Itamar Ben-Gvir won on the last elections in Israel 500,000 votes. They represent a lot of people. Same all these extremists in the Israeli government. They are representing the majority within the Israelis. This is the problem. We are not talking about, there are extremists all over the world. You can find racists all over the world. But usually, in a normal societies, in democratic societies, these are totally marginalized communities. Nobody wants to bring them to rule. Nobody puts them as ministers. But this is not the case in Israel. Unfortunately, this is the real face of the society and state in Israel. Bezalel Smotrich, Itamar Ben-Gvir, Benjamin Netanyahu, they are running the state.
We've been seeing protests in Israel over the last couple of weeks calling for a new deal in Gaza, calling for, there were some reservists that were saying that they wouldn't go back. Now that there's been an announcement very clearly, tens of thousands of reservists are going back for extended periods of time. There is this news that there's going to be permanent occupation of at least some parts of Gaza. How has the public reacted to this?
Unfortunately, from the beginning of this war, there was a very fast deterioration within the Israeli general public, those who supported the coalition and those who supported the opposition. Unfortunately, the vast majority of the Israelis supports the war. They have a problem with the Israeli hostages in Gaza. We, of course, totally think differently about this thing. We want to see peace. We want to end not just this war, we want to end the Israeli-Palestinian conflict on a solution based on the values of justice and equality for all, Israelis and Palestinians. Unfortunately, Muhammad, we don't have Israeli partners for this basic, normal human rights agenda. In the coalition and in the opposition, they supported the war. They supported the war crimes. There wasn't one statement of an Israeli politician from the Israeli coalition or opposition that came from human values against the war to say basic things that they are against killing innocent people. They are against starving babies to death. There is something really dangerous, not just for the Palestinians, for the whole area, this way of thinking about all the non-Jews as inferiors and non-human in order to allow Israel to do all these crimes. This is something really dangerous, and I think it is going also to be dangerous for the Israeli society itself. These people committing all these war crimes, they are not going to be healthy psychologically later on. They will come back to this society with all this thick way of thinking. It's very dangerous for everyone, including the Israelis. But their insistence on revenge and violence is preventing them from seeing the truth.
And we keep seeing polls coming out of Israel measuring public opinion about the war, and there increasingly has been shifting towards wanting the government to make another deal with Hamas, one that brings the rest of the hostages home. There are these polls that suggest that the majority of Israeli public now don't believe that the war is going to lead to that hostage return. How do we feel about these polls? Do you think that they're not representative of what the public actually wants?
I think, of course, and I think that the majority wants to have the hostages. This is basic human thing. We also don't want to see hostages. We don't also want to see political prisoners. We want all the people to be free, Israelis and Palestinians. Any human being who has some human standards don't want to see all these people suffering. Not the Israelis and not the Palestinians. But the problem that we see within the Israeli public opinion is that they care only about the Israeli hostages. They talk about the 59 people who we want them also released, but they are forgetting 2,300,000 Palestinians. They are seeing that Israel is bombing the hospitals and the churches and the mosques and the infrastructure and not allowing people to eat. They are starving people to death. And you don't see any signs in their demonstrations asking to stop the starvation of all their hostages and the Palestinians. This is why there is something wrong within this understanding of what's happening within the Israeli society. Part of the people who see the demonstration thinks that there are those who are against the war. No, they are not against the war. They just want to save their hostages. They care only about their hostages, which is something totally human and understandable if you would see them also talking a little bit about the other side suffering. There's a genocide going on. Israel is a very small state, Hamad. Most of the people have family members involved in this genocide. They know what's going on. It's geographically very small. The community is very small. Everybody knows that there is something wrong, but nobody cares. And this is something dangerous, not just for us. This is dangerous because sometimes it brings you to lose hope in humanity, Muhammad. A society like the Jewish society that suffered a genocide and now is, after a few decades, committing a genocide for another people. It is something really dangerous for all humanity, not just for us. And you wouldn't imagine that the victims of such a cruel crime would be victimizers a few decades after that. You would expect them to be more human, more open-minded, would go against such a crime, not to allow it.
And there's always this question about just how aware the Israeli public is to what is happening on the ground in Gaza, how aware they are of what the statements that come out of Hamas, for example. And there was a real moment where that barrier felt like it was crossed earlier this year during those hostage negotiation ceremonies that Hamas organized. And they were broadcast basically into the home living room of every single Israeli. And that was viewed by many as a clear victory for Hamas and a clear sign of failure for Israel's government and Israel's war. Do you think that moment really incentivized the government in Israel to scrap that ceasefire, stop these kind of displays and into people's homes and return to the war arena?
First of all, I think that the Israeli public don't want to see the truth. They are choosing only to see their media, which is lying to them from the beginning of the war. They have options. Everybody can watch, and a lot of them knows English, a lot of them knows other languages. if they want to, they can see the truth. They are choosing to continue being blind in order to continue the crimes. And they are choosing so. Now, there is no serious discussion within the Israeli society regarding all these crimes. And anyone who brings his voice against the war crimes is being silenced. We are not allowed to do demonstrations against the war. Imagine a society that have a consensus on war crimes. Everybody is allowed to ask for a genocide or destruction or starving people to death. All this is allowed and legitimate. The only voice which says that wars is bad, wars are unhuman, stop wars, there is no military solution for the Palestinian question, we are considered extreme and our voices are silenced. Imagine what kind of a society they are developing here. All of those who are supporting a genocide are considered legitimate. Those who are supporting peace are considered extreme. There is something sick.
I want to ask you, Sami, to round off our conversation, what it's like for you as a citizen of Israel, as somebody who used to spend your entire career working within the machinations of the Israeli government and the Israeli Knesset, and now as a citizen that sees all of this climate that you described around you of denial, of refusing to acknowledge what is happening. As a Palestinian, how does that feel, watching all of this unfold, knowing that there are limits to what you yourself can and can't say in public?
First of all, as a human being, before of being a Palestinian, this is, and we are living in an unbearable situation. You are seeing a genocide, but you are not allowed to raise your voice against the genocide. You are not allowed to demonstrate against the genocide. You are not allowed to say anything based on the values of justice and equality for all. And as a Palestinian, these people who are being killed daily are my people. They are our families. And I am talking to you now from Yafa. In 1948, our families passed the ethnic cleansing of the Nakba of 1948. Big part of them have been expelled to Gaza. These are our direct families, Muhammad, and they are killing our cousins and every family in Yafa. We have relatives in Gaza, and we are seeing them passing all this unhuman suffering that nobody can really suffer in the world, happening for 1.5 years, and the world is watching. Not just the Israelis are committing the crimes. There is the whole world which is allowing this to happen for more than 1.5 years. And we are talking after the very hard experience of the Second World War, where everybody said no more. But no more seems to be, they meant only for white Europeans or for the Jews. It does not include Palestinians, this no more. It does not include Arabs. It does not include those who are not Europeans. There is something racist also in this, and it's unbelievable what's happening. It has been happening for 1.5 years. Bombing tents, babies. Nobody can call this a war. This is a genocide. And it must stop. It must stop.
Sami Abu Shhadeh, we always appreciate your voice and your insight. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you.
Sami Abu Shhadeh, former Knesset member there, and you can follow our minute-by-minute coverage of Gaza and Israel on our live blog at MiddleEastEye.net. Stay tuned now as we turn to Syria and Israel's military plans for the wider region.
Now, while Gaza is bearing the brunt of Israeli fire, it is not the only place that Israel has been bombing. This afternoon, Israel bombed Yemen for the second time in 24 hours after blasting Syria, Lebanon, Yemen, and Gaza on a single day on Monday. A war on 7 fronts. This is what Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has repeatedly said his nation faces.
Today, Israel is defending itself on 7 fronts against the enemies of civilization. We're fighting in Gaza against Hamas, those savages who murdered, raped, beheaded, and burned our people on October 7th. We're fighting in Lebanon against Hezbollah, the most heavily armed terror organization in the world, which was planning an even greater massacre than October 7th on our northern border, and that has rocketed Israeli towns and cities for nearly a year. We're fighting against the Houthis in Yemen and the Shiite militias in Iraq and Syria that together have launched hundreds of drones and missile attacks against Israel. We're fighting against terrorists in Judea and Samaria who are trying to murder civilians in the heart of our cities. And we're fighting against Iran, which last week fired over 200 ballistic missiles directly at Israel, and which stands behind the seven-front war against Israel.
Gaza, Lebanon, Yemen, Iraq, Syria, the West Bank, and Iran. But critics inside and outside Israel have questioned how much is the government forced to fight on all fronts, and how much is it choosing to? To understand, today we spotlight Syria, a country already struggling to rebuild following a decade-long civil war that toppled a dictator, devastated the country's infrastructure, and led to the world's largest exodus of refugees. On Friday, Israel pummeled its neighbour with over 20 airstrikes, escalating its offensive against Syria that began almost as soon as Bashar al-Assad was toppled, and which most recently has been framed by Israel as a security measure and a bid to protect Syria's Druze minority. Sectarian clashes broke out last week between Sunni gunmen and local Druze groups, resulting in the killing of dozens of people south of Damascus. It adds to a string of attacks that have left some Syrian minorities in fear of violent disorder. But Druze leaders in Syria have rejected Israel's attacks and, over the weekend, signed a security agreement with Syria's transitional government. Israel's airstrikes have continued. And as well as airstrikes, Israel's attacks on post-Assad Syria have included a major ground incursion in the border-lying Golan Heights. So, is Israel's war on seven fronts a war to protect itself and defend persecuted minorities? Or is it a war of colonial expansion, a bid for regional hegemony based on its own religious prophecies? Joining us now is expert Syrian analyst Omar Ozkizilchik. Welcome, Omar. Now, Omar, the immediate context...
Thanks for having me.
The immediate context to these attacks is, of course, the sectarian violence that we've seen within Syria. Attacks against Druze minorities following earlier attacks against Alawite minorities seen as affiliated with Assad. Putting Israel aside for the moment, how severe is the danger against Druze and minority Syrians right now?
But first of all, when it comes to what happened in Syria, it all began with a fake news, and then mob trying to attack Jewish students in the city of Homs of Syria, and the Syrian government force intervened to protect the Jewish students and rescued them from the mob. But later on, we have seen that in the suburbs of Damascus, former pro-regime Druze militias opened fire against the Syrian government forces and engaged in clash with the Syrian army. And in response to this fire of violence, we have seen that the Syrian army sent in reinforcements as well as Druze militias, not to fight the Syrian army, but to support it against these former pro-regime government, pro-regime Druze militias. So the Druze are not a unified entity. They have different approaches, and the two biggest Druze militias are Rijal al-Karama and Liwa Jabal al-Arab, and both have coordinated their efforts with Damascus in this. And altogether, there is a huge effort by the Syrian government to try to avoid any sectarian violence in Syria and to try to protect the minorities. And we see that the Druze and the Syrian government have been successful in reaching an agreement to restore order and calm in the area. And these former pro-regime Druze militias have been disarmed now.
Of course, Israel has said that its interventions were in response to this sectarian violence, and perhaps that the attempts by the government to protect minorities may be a response to their airstrikes. So if we look at where Israel has attacked and when Israel has attacked Syria, how sincere do their claims appear that they are launching these airstrikes in order to protect Druze minorities?
Yeah, in terms of timing, it doesn't fit up because the Israeli airstrikes for the second time now, in order to protect the Druze, happened after the Druze and Damascus reached an agreement. So if it's in order to protect the Druze, why is Israel bombing Syrian locations and facilities after the Druze reached an agreement with Damascus and everything has been settled down? So this isn't to protect the Druze. And if it was to protect the Druze, then many among the Druze community ask where Israel was when ISIS killed over 250 Druze civilians in 2018. At that time, we haven't seen any effort by the Israeli Air Force to protect the Druze against the terror attacks of ISIS. And furthermore, we have seen that the Druze religious, political, and military leaders came together, reached an agreement with Damascus, and they openly stated that they reject any foreign interference in Syria, that they don't want Israeli protection, and that they will be the first to fight off any foreign intervention. That being said, there is only one particular figure, namely Sheikh Hikmet al-Hajeri, who has been portrayed as the religious leader of the Druze by the Israeli affiliated media. However, in reality, he is one of the three main religious leaders in Suwaida among the Druze, and he was the only person who has called on Israel to protect them. And even he has been now sidelined, and he had to agree to the deal with Damascus as well. So all due to the pressure from other Druze actors. So all of these coming together, this is clear. This is not to protect the minorities or the Druze.
Well, why then would Israel be launching these airstrikes in Syria, in your view?
I mean, the Israeli airstrikes should be differentiated. One were to decimate the capability of the Syrian army after the fall of the Assad regime. We have seen hundreds of airstrikes in that regard to destroy air defense systems, aircraft, radar systems, etc. But these recent airstrikes, which were claimed to protect the Druze, are more of an interference by Israel into the domestic political affairs of Syria, as Israel does not want a unified, stable, secure Syria with a strong Damascus. Israel believes that a divided Syria along sectarian and ethnic lines is the best way to keep Syria weak and unstable and to project further the Israeli regional ambitions and geopolitical ambitions and goals. It's the stated goal of Israel to prevent Syria from becoming stable.
You describe this geopolitical strategy of destabilizing its neighbor by Israel. This week, we've also seen airstrikes by Syria against Yemen, against Lebanon. Netanyahu has talked about this war on 7 fronts. You know, he would say that the attacks against Yemen and Lebanon are targeting Iran-backed militias. But there are people who question whether this escalation in the region reflects what you were just describing when you said Israel has a strategy, an explicit strategy in some cases, to destabilize its neighboring countries. Is this all part of that?
Yes, obviously, and I think it is the most obvious in the case of Syria, because in the case of Lebanon and Yemen and the Gaza conflict, there were always some Israeli excuse and pretext. But in the case of Syria, there was literally zero aggressive action by the Syrian side against Israel. There were zero attacks from Syria towards Israel, and there was a state intention by the Syrian transitional government to respect Israel as a state and to go back to the 74 deconfliction line. And what we have seen now is a one-side aggression, an unprovoked aggression by the Israeli sides. And all of this, what's happening is more and more showing, especially in Syria, that the main goal of Israel is to be free in bombing wherever they want, whenever they want, and however they want. And this is not an approach that's sustainable. This is a miscalculation on the side of Israel. What Israel is actually doing also with the Druze and in the region is further pushing people towards their governments and encouraging and emphasizing and strengthening the governance in these states. Especially in Syria, we have seen that the Druze are now much more willing to make concessions towards Damascus and willing to make an agreement with Damascus due to the threat they perceive from Israel as well. And we see that the people in these regions, that they have lowered their demands from the new government in Damascus. So actually, it is a miscalculated policy. What Israel is doing is further enhancing the new Syrian transitional government to emphasize and strengthen itself and to manifest itself.
Now, Israel or the Israeli government might say that it is not the only one to have made military moves in Syria since the fall of the Assad regime. Israel has pointed out that Israel has argued Turkey is trying to turn Syria into its protectorate after Turkey expanded its military presence in the north and has sought to neutralize Kurdish forces on its border. Is there any truth to Israel's claims that Turkey is trying to turn Syria into its own satellite state?
So first of all, even if Turkey wanted to turn Syria into its satellite state, Turkey cannot. Because Syria needs a funding, Syria needs economic revival, Syria needs a reconstruction, and Turkey doesn't have the funds to do that. Turkey doesn't have the power to do that. Secondly, the Syrian side is not a side that is willing to become the puppet of anyone. We have seen this for much time, even when the current Syrian president was only in the region of Idlib. He always made sure that to have an independency and to have an autonomous area from the Turks, even though he was heavily reliant on the Turks at that time. Now, with opening up, with the engagement with the Arab states, with the European states and the world, we see that Syria is becoming an independent state. From the Turkish perspective, it doesn't make sense to turn Syria into a puppet state, because if that would be the case, then Syria would not be a bridge between Turkey and Arab world, which Turkey actually wants. Turkey wants Syria to be the opening gate into the Arab world. But if Syria is a puppet, it will become an obstacle in the relations between the Arab states and Turkey, and will torpedo the Turkish normalizations with the Arab states in the region. So it's much more efficient for Turkey to have Syria as a real partner, as an independent state. And we have seen so far that Turkey has made sure to keep this distance towards Syria for it to be perceived as an independent state, and it has been perceived that way, because it is. And lastly, and most importantly, the Turkish approach in Syria in terms of military presence is something that is without an alternative for Syria. There is literally no alternative for Syria other than Turkey, who can establish a military presence in Syria as a security guarantor to protect Syria's airspace, to protect Syria's sovereignty, and especially to help Syria in the fight against ISIS. Because in the desert where ISIS militants still operate, there needs aerial surveillance, and the Syrian side doesn't possess this capability to have aerial surveillance. And Turkey, together with Jordan and Lebanon and Iraq, is willing to step in as the regional coalition to fight against ISIS. So the Israeli statements are not that Israel is fearing that Syria will become a Turkish protectorate. Moreover, Israel fears that if the Turks establish a base in Syria, that their freedom to bomb whenever they want, wherever they want, however they want, will be limited. So once the Turkish military and air force is present in Syria, it will be much more difficult for Israel to bomb the Syrian territory. That's the main issue.
Now, quickly, before we wrap, the response from Syria's President Ahmed al-Sharaa has been fairly diplomatic. He's avoided escalatory language, although he has denounced the attacks. But despite this pretty measured response, Israel has continued its airstrikes. So I wonder, is there a limit to Sharaa's patience? How likely is Israel to face any retaliation for its attacks?
Actually, this is also one part of the miscalculation on the side of Israel. So Israel claims that it has conducted these airstrikes to prevent a Turkish military base from being established in Syria. But actually now, seeing the Israeli aggression, the Syrian side is much more eager to invite Turkey into Syria to establish its military base, and is now rushing and trying to urge Turkey to be as fast as possible, even though there are some technical issues that need to be resolved before Turkey will deploy probably its military forces to Syria. So the Syrian side will very likely not retaliate against Israel, but keep this calm, because Syria does not want a new escalation. The Syrians are fed up with war. The Syrians want to restore their country, rebuild their country, and rehabilitate as a society, as a nation. And what Syria would probably do is try to get in the Turks to protect them against Israel and to limit Israeli aggression. And once the Turks are in, I expect that the United States of America will come in and mediate a security mechanism between Turkey and Israel that will ultimately limit the Israeli aggressions against Syria. And then we will see a de-escalatory part emerging.
Omar Özkazilcik, thank you for joining us at MEELive. Now, we can also look to Israeli officials to explain these attacks. Last week, Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich stated, "The fighting will not continue. The fighting will not end until hundreds of thousands of Gazans leave and Syria is partitioned." But Druze leaders... There are often contradictions between Israel's diplomatic statements abroad and internal statements by government officials about whether the goal is inward security or outward expansion. In an opinion piece for Middle East Eye, Sumaya Ghanouchi argued that Smotrich's stated goals lay behind the bombing of residential neighborhoods in Syria like Nawa, where 9 civilians were killed by Israeli airstrikes. But, she said, this strategy is founded on a fatal illusion.
Israel's position is unmistakable. There is no room for Syrian sovereignty. A nation reeling from decades of war is told it must sacrifice not only its independence, but its alliances, its memory, its voice. Yet something is stirring in Syria. The funeral of the 9 slain in Nawa became a procession of defiance. Across the country, Syrians poured into the streets. The fatigue of war is giving way to a new resolve. A generation that once lost hope is finding it again, not in governments, but in the land itself. Because Syria is not merely a state, it is a civilization. It is the cradle of empires, the graveyard of invaders. It endured the Crusades, repelled colonialism, and rose against tyranny. Its wounds are many, but its spirit endures. The enemy may be powerful, but the land remembers. Israel's strategy, for all its calculation, is built on a fatal illusion that a nation can be erased by redrawing maps and dropping bombs. But Syria is not just territory. It is Nawa and Yarmouk, Ibn Kathir and Saladin, Sultan Basha al-Atrash and Khalid ibn al-Walid. It is history made flesh, dignity engraved in the soil. Syria will not disappear. It will not fragment quietly, and its people, however battered, are awakening. What Israel has unleashed in southern Syria is not submission, it is remembrance. For Syrians and Palestinians, the struggle is shared, the wound is won, and history, long witness to the rise and fall of empires, remains on their side.
So let's round up. After today's show, is there evidence that in this intensification of the language of conquest Israel's using in Gaza and its airstrikes in multiple countries beyond Gaza, are we seeing a coordinated, wider regional military campaign by Netanyahu's government?
It's hard to tell. I think the easy thing to say is that Israel has always had a plan. It's following the step-by-step process. But when you look on the ground, when you look at the flip-flopping, when you look at the multiple strategies that Israel and the Israeli government has taken, I think they don't know what they're doing. I think they keep trying things and they keep going back to things. Meanwhile, at the heart of it, there is this political question about what Benjamin Netanyahu's survival means, but also, like Sami Abu Shhadeh said, what the Israeli public wants, how much appetite they have for war, and how much appetite they have for putting the lives of those hostages in the firing line.
I see what you're saying in terms of there's massive indication of a sort of government crisis in Israel, indicating that a lot of these decisions being made by Netanyahu are more inward-looking than they are outward-looking. But even if Netanyahu doesn't have a plan beyond sort of holding on to his own position of power, don't you think that the people he's capitulating to in order to stay in power, they have a plan? People like, as we've mentioned a couple times today, Bezalel Smotrich and his further right-wing party that the Likud is in partnership with. Even if Netanyahu doesn't have a plan, others do. And if the international community does not respond to Israel's constant pushing of the boundaries, then I do think that there's a likelihood that this plan could become a reality.
And this is one of the things that Sami also highlighted, right? You know, he used to be in the Knesset as an MP for a long time, and he was standing across from some of these far-right figures standing in Israeli parliament and speaking things that the international community tends to try and shy away from. Bezalel Smotrich is one of these people. Itamar Ben-Gvir is another one of these people. Both of them, as he rightly pointed out, are elected officials, voted into government by hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people. And so what they say, as insane as it sounds to us, represents at least a sector inside Israel. And as you mentioned, the real question is, how far are we watching this war continue before there are real boundaries that are set up by the international community? We saw that happening in the ICJ last week, and we're waiting to see what the judges say.
I do think there's a discrepancy between the messaging Israel is putting out towards audiences like our own, many of whom are tuning in from the UK, from the US, and messaging that Israel is putting out at home, that Israeli officials are putting out at home. And I do think at some point we're going to have to confront the realities that many leading Israel's campaign are openly admitting to. And whatever our government's feelings are on it, at least respond to what is being said is happening and not what we choose to believe is happening. Does that make sense?
And it's something, yeah, it does make sense. And one of the things that I hear often from Israeli activists, peace activists, is that, you know, don't pay attention to what Netanyahu says in English. Pay attention to what he says in Hebrew, because those are the messages that he's saying to his constituency. Those are the messages that he is really trying to reflect his strategy in Gaza.
But that's tricky because how many people outside of Israel speak Hebrew? And I wonder if that's sort of taken for granted by people like Smotrich.
Well, here at MEE, we're doing a lot of work to try and translate a lot of what gets said and in Israeli media, because I think it's important for people to actually be able to get an insight into those conversations that are happening domestically.
Yeah. It's really important to open that information flow out to the wider world. But it's not just what we think. We really want to know what all of you watching think. You can add your comments, of course, to the live chat, or you can contact us across social media platforms. Our handle is @MiddleEastEye. You can also email MEELive@middleeasteye.net.
Make sure you turn on those notifications so you know exactly when we're going live. It happens right here every Tuesday, every Thursday, 5 p.m. British Standard Time, or 12 p.m. if you're in New York.
See you then.